Welcome to Automotive EV. It's my great pleasure to welcome two super speakers today and then for a panel discussion. But firstly, I will hand you over to Adam, who will be doing the first presentation. Hi, Adam, and it's over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, and thank you to Automotive EV for having me on today. I'm just going to share my screen with you. One moment. Okay, so my name is Adam Panayi. I'm the Managing Director of Rho Motion. We're a research and consultancy in the EV and battery space. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the rise of European sales versus China mainly, and what that means for battery demand and the composition of battery chemistry. Just a quick introduction to who we are. Like I said, we're a research and consultancy house. We provide monthly reports and quarterly outlooks, as well as consulting work. And our methodology is effectively bottom up. So we look at every vehicle that's been sold in the market, and we collect a number of metrics pertinent to this discussion: our range, battery pack size, battery chemistry, on both the cathode and the anode side. And we also collect all the charging data. We then take the monthly sales data, model by model basis, run it through our database, and it generates our EV battery chemistry assessment, which gives an aggregated split of battery chemistries and battery pack sizes, battery demand for the industry. We also do a similar thing on the charging side of things, but looking at max power for charging. And then our outlooks cover EV and battery. So that's looking at battery demand, number of EVs sold by region, split of cathode and anode demand. And also we do a similar thing on the charging side of things as well, looking at both the demand side and the supply side. So my presentation today is really going to cover this key issue, which is the rise of Europe in the total battery market. So what the charts show you are sales to July for different regions in the world for battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicle sales for 2019 and 2020. And the key thing to really think about here is this relationship between the rate of development of the European market and its increase in market share versus China. The other regions, the US and Canada, the rest of the world, are important, but for this discussion, really it's this trade-off between Europe and China that's the crucial piece. And the reason it matters is because in Europe, you have a much higher percentage of plug-in hybrids being sold, and that has an implication for pack sizes, battery demand as a result, but also crucially battery chemistry, and we'll work through all of that in time. About what's driving the market and what's driving that change between the rate of market share between Europe and China. And the first thing to talk about, really, if only to get it out of the way, is around the COVID response. So people always ask us, well, do you think that COVID is going to have a big impact on the EV market? Generally speaking, it's thought of it will be quite positive for lots of different reasons, but not least because there will be more government spending coming into this market in the next couple of years as a result of the COVID response. But it's slightly overblown, especially for this year. Most of the incentives kick in next year that have been announced from directly related to COVID and directly to EV from that. Those circles there. A lot of them apply on the charging side as well, which is even longer term in terms of the way it impacts EV adoption. But there is going to be some impact from the increase in spending directly related to COVID. But as you can see in the chart, it's fairly minimal compared to the rest of the government spending announcements. Where you really start to see a big impact is on the subsidy and incentive. When we think about legislation or government intervention in this market, we think about it in three ways. Firstly is obviously emergency intervention in the idea of COVID spending, for example. Second is on subsidies and incentives, which are a short-term measure as well. And the third is relating to emissions. So that necessarily, but this chart just shows you the available subsidy or incentives by country, and in some cases by states within that country or by region within that country, for a sample of countries. I've taken the axis off just to protect our IP, but the trend is clear. And these policy measures really do have a big impact in the near term on EV sales. So they will affect sales year to year. And I'll show you some numbers for China from this year and last year, and you'll really see that Chinese subsidy changes make a big difference to the amount of vehicles being sold. The other interesting thing as well is if you just look at the left-hand side of that chart, you have the US, and then that's California, that's what the CA stands for. And if you look towards the right-hand side of the chart, you have the US federal level subsidy and incentive. You see there's big differences within countries where you are for the maximum amount of support you'll get from the government, either at a tax incentive stage, direct purchase subsidy, a scrappage subsidy, and so on. But what really drives the market long-term and enables OEMs to take long-term positions in terms of investments in this is emissions legislation. And emissions legislation really comes under two banners. One is air quality, you might think of, nitrous oxide and particulate matter specifically. And the other one is greenhouse gas, CO2. And they work sort of almost in contrast to each other in some respects, I would say. The last 2 decades have seen a big focus on the air quality issues around automotive. And that has, well, led in some respects, I mean, it's a bit of a long story, but it's led in some respects to the reduction in the number of diesel sales. I mean, that's really come in a big way post the VW crisis, the Dieselgate crisis. And what that's led to is an increase in the fleet average CO2 emissions from virtually every OEM. So diesel performs very well on CO2 compared to gasoline. And the reduction in diesel vehicle sales as a percentage of total automotive sales in Europe specifically has seen an increase in CO2. So what this chart shows you is the fleet average CO2 emissions for every major OEM in Europe for 2017, 2018 and 2019. And then the 95 grams target that you see there in red drawn across the chart is being phased in this year into next year. And then there's a fine of 95 euros for every gram you're above that target, multiplied by your vehicle sales. So a couple of things to point out. In virtually every case, CO2 emissions have been getting worse on a fleet average basis for OEMs. In some cases, that's not quite the case, but on average, that's true. And also the fact that virtually every OEM is quite some distance, even at the stage of 2019, is some distance away from this line. That, if you think about the number of vehicles sold in a given by a given OEM, those fines can run into billions. And for someone like VW, it's equivalent to the types of fines they received for emission scandal. So, you know, in the order of tens of billions of euros expected away. So you really see that OEMs have left with actually no option in the absence of being able to use diesel in a major way and increasing CO2. They have to move over to electrification. In Europe, that's largely been through plug-in hybrid electrification as well as battery electric, and we'll come to that again in more detail momentarily. So the other thing that this means is that penetration rates have been increasing this year versus last year. This chart shows you, again, the rate until July, the penetration rate until July, and then the equivalent in the black and white stripes of 2019. So in virtually every case, it's risen. The numbers are slightly flattered this year because obviously COVID has impacted the total vehicle market in a major way, but that hasn't really been felt so much for the EV market because those sales tend to be on order for a long time, and also, you know, there's just so many incentives pushing towards now that EV sales have held up relatively well, which I'll come to shortly. But as I said, you know, penetration rates have risen very sharply this year, even in somewhere like Norway where they were already very high, well over 50%. So just working through this now for the different regions. So what this chart shows you is monthly sales for 2018, 2019 and 2020 for battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles in China. And a couple of things to point out. So I just want to come back to the impact of subsidies and why they matter. If you look at June and the year till June for 2019, so the purple bar is very high sales all of the first half of 2019 and a sharp contraction in the second half of the year. And that was because the Chinese government effectively halved the subsidy available to consumers for buying battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. This year, obviously, the market has had COVID to contend with. In China, that kicked off a lot quicker than or a lot earlier than it did in Europe and North America. So the real impact was felt January, but recovered fairly well since then. And the subsidy has been maintained at the rate at which it was left from July 2019 onwards. So sales are recovering in a fairly uniform sort of a way. There's been no policy-led jump in that this year. In Europe, the growth has been absolutely incredible this year, and we were fairly bullish on Europe, but we weren't necessarily this bullish. So it's been remarkable, the increase in sales. So just walking you through this chart as well, you see that there's fairly uniform growth year to year in 2018 and 2019, and this year it's really kicked off in a big way. Apart from April, which is really where you saw the impact. But compared to what happened to the rest of the economy, and it continues to happen to the rest of the economy in the European Union and in the UK as well, the impact has been negligible for the EV market. And as I said, that's a function of these short-term policy measures, subsidies and incentives, but also the fact that in Europe specifically, demand was being curtailed by availability of decent vehicles. That has started to change significantly. And order books for good EV market this year are very, very strong. The ID3 is a good example of that. It's really got released this month. Show those figures for next month. And then finally, the US. So when we talk about the EV market, we talk about China, Europe, and the US. That covers virtually 90% of the sales, and other regions obviously are there, but these are big regions. But in the US, there's very little federally mandated support for the market, as I showed in the earlier chart showing the subsidies and incentives. There was a tax credit for vehicles being sold earlier in 2018 and 2019. That has now been exhausted for Tesla and GM. It's linked to the number of vehicle sales from an OEM. Those are really the only two OEMs selling battery electric vehicles in the market. They've exhausted their allowance, and that really has weighed on the growth of sales. This year, obviously, again, you had March and April, and to some extent May, and even into June, vehicles, the impact of COVID been affecting vehicle sales. And that's because really, again, there's been no support to re-energize the market post-COVID, or as we come out of the worst of the COVID period in Q1 and Q2 of this year. And we were bearish on the US specifically at the start of the year, and clearly there's no reason to be any more bullish about it post-COVID. So really expect this market to be relatively flat year on year, which, given the growth you see elsewhere in the world, is fairly remarkable of itself. Okay, so why does this matter beyond unit sales? Because we're a company that looks at batteries in a lot of detail, and what this chart shows you is on the left-hand axis is the and that's the bars, this percentage split of battery electric versus plug-in hybrid electric vehicles in a given region. And on the right-hand axis, and I apologise, I should have put the units on the axis, but on the right-hand axis is kilowatt hours size for the market. So let's walk through this. Starting with the US and Canada, roughly 80% battery electric vehicles sold versus battery electric and plug-in hybrid, so 20% plug-in hybrid. In Europe, it's roughly 50-50, so a little bit in favour of battery electric. And in China, it's roughly 75-25. The impact of that is that on the red bar, which is the average pack size, you get significant differences in the average pack size when you weight it over battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric taken together. If you were just to show battery electric versus battery electric, you would see virtually no difference. Maybe slightly lower in China because they have a large number of smaller vehicles with quite small pack sizes that are pure battery electric. But in any case, this is having a real impact on battery demand this year because it's been led by Europe. That's the only thing really keeping the numbers up. And the fact that a lot of those European sales of plug-in hybrids with pack sizes roughly, let's say 18 kilowatt hours versus 60 kilowatt hours for a battery electric vehicle. Also has an impact on the range of battery chemistries on this. And I mean, this audience may not be so familiar with these splits, but effectively this is the cathode split on battery electric batteries sold in a given year. We also do this for anode, but cathode is the one that most people think about most readily. So I'm just going to talk you through the impact of Europe being the predominant sales piece this year. And that's affected two things. One is on 523 demand. So 523 is the most commonly deployed cathode technology in plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and that's because of the way that you charge and discharge those vehicles. So for a plug-in hybrid, people tend to charge it 100% and discharge it 100%, and then when it's down to zero, they'll just run off the engine. Whereas for battery electric vehicles, it's incredibly rare that anyone would fully discharge their battery because you'd be stuck. So people tend to charge at 20% or 30% or 50% or whatever else it is, and also the cycling is managed more readily by the battery pack. Why does 523 predominant in plug-in hybrids? Well, it's because of the cobalt. Higher cobalt lends stability to the battery for discharging and charging, also lends stability to the battery on thermal management, which is not necessarily as important in this instance. But that's why 523 is still hanging around in a fairly big way when people would have perhaps expected it to fall off. The other one is 622. 622 is the predominant battery chemistry for battery electric vehicles in Europe. People talk about moving to 811. European OEMs have been reluctant to move on from this relatively high cobalt battery chemistry, mainly because of the safety aspect around thermal management. So that's a big issue. The 811 piece you see there, it's growing rapidly in China, and it's almost exclusively a China story at the moment. Yeah, there's a different risk protocol, you might say, in China for some of these vehicles, and they're more willing to take the risk on the NCM 811. European OEMs can't afford that risk at the moment. And then finally, on LFP, people have talked a lot about LFP this year because Tesla have announced and have started to take orders on LFP equipped vehicles for their Model 3 made in China. Now, that's slightly overblown in terms of the impact this year, because for Tesla specifically, those vehicles, they started taking orders in July, but the vehicles won't start rolling off the production line until later this year. And actually will only increase next year. They're also offering both NCM-based vehicles and LFP together. So that's that's one thing. Also, this year you've seen a decrease in the amount of buses sold in China. Buses have very large battery packs and are virtually all LFP. And that's impacted LFP demand this year. And finally, the model lineup with LFP equipped is being released this year, but the sales won't really pick up to next year. So the LFP story is coming next year in a bigger way than it has this year. And I'm just going to completely change the subject for my. So I just want to leave you with one thing, which is around OEM investment and where it's going. So we track this obviously all the time, and we released this chart this quarter because the 2025 OEM investment at a vehicle level surpassed 500 billion for the first time. So we thought that was noteworthy. But what I really want to draw your attention to is joint ventures. And it matters because at the moment, 14% of the battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles being sold are via joint ventures. And I'll just be very clear about what I mean by joint ventures. That in essence means Western OEMs partnering with Chinese OEMs in China to sell vehicles in China. Now, that makes a big difference in terms of what the types of battery chemistries that are going to get rolled out. But more importantly, it makes a big difference in terms of R&D spending and intellectual property in this market. It's going to be heavily weighted in China. That 14% is going to double over the next decade. A lot of Western OEMs operating in China with Chinese OEMs. We include Tesla in that, the Tesla Shanghai project in that. It's not strictly speaking a joint venture, but it effectively functions as one. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. That's what I have to say to you. I'm very open to questions, so please do either get in touch or ask them now. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. What I'd like to do is to have the bulk of the questions at the end. Great presentation. And if I now could welcome Jay Nagley from the Department of Trade to the stage.
Hello, and thanks very much. My name's Jay Nagley. I'm an R&D specialist at the automotive team in DIT, and I'm just going to give a presentation on the implications for electric vehicles. Just 1 second as I load up the presentation.
Thank you.
Right, here we go. Can everybody see that okay?
Not seeing the presentation yet.
Oh, I've got a message saying can't display content. Now, why is that? Just give me a second. Let me try again. Saying opening presentation. Okay, I'm getting the first screen up.
Are you sharing with us on it?
Let me just check that. I believe so. It's just saying cannot start presentation, which is not a message I've ever seen before. Would you be able to use the version I sent you on Friday, Peter?
Richard, have we got that to hand, or how can we help Jay? This is technology at its best. Well, whilst we're waiting for Jay's presentation to upload, thanks to the efficiency of Microsoft, if I could come back to you as well for a second, Adam, do you feel that the sort of order level Volkswagen have had the biggest impact of change with the ID3?
Yes, I mean, the pre-orders for that have been fairly significant, or very significant. In terms of what that means, I mean, it just gives them faith in order to make those investments longer term as well, because clearly, as I mentioned, in Europe, the issue has largely been in the last couple of years that demand has been held back by supply, that there hasn't been enough decent vehicles beyond really the Tesla and a few other bits and pieces, particularly on plug-in hybrids. But for pure battery electrics made by a European OEM, there's very little solid offering. I mean, that's really changing this year. And the ID3 is really the bellwether for the industry, I'd say, in terms of whether that can really take off.
Perfect, thank you. I think if we've got chance, we'll go back to Jay now.
Peter, I've had a message saying that I've been brought in as, oh, right, okay, I think I've just been given rights. Apparently, I was in as an attendee on the link.
Okay.
Rather than as a presenter, so that may now be corrected. 1 second. No, I'm still not being allowed to display, unfortunately.
Well, whilst, again, if this is okay with you, whilst we're waiting for that, to sort of technology help, if I could just come back to you for a second, Adam, or a minute or two.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we may as well sort of continue and do some of the later things now. When we're looking at battery, we're looking at sizing, we're looking at charging, we're looking at subsidies, and we're looking at the overall uptake for electric vehicles. Are subsidies the biggest driver, or is it actually the range of the vehicle that people are looking at more?
I would say that, we think of it as the driver for everything is legislation in the long term. So that's aside from subsidies and incentives, because that really dictates the rate of change for the technology and how OEMs meet that legislation. But then the subsidies and incentives piece is a good short-term measure for governments to promote the uptake of these vehicles, allow OEMs to get scale, and then bring down the cost. Because ultimately, you asked about range there. I don't really see range as an issue anymore for these vehicles. The way that a typical battery electric vehicle, I mean, there's quite a big diversity in what they can achieve. But if you can do 250 miles on a single charge, I mean, that's getting you virtually anywhere within European driving habits, at least, that you would need to be, especially within 1 day. Where the issues are on the range side or on the charging side, we're still in the process of building out a comprehensive charging infrastructure. And also the other issue is, from a battery point of view, as it pertains to range, is that most EVs can't charge at ultra fast rates. So you have a situation where the charging technology is moving on at quite a good pace in terms of increasing the speeds, but the EVs themselves can't. So that's going to be interesting over time. And then finally, really the thing that's held back adoption, as I said, is availability of decent vehicles, but then obviously price and subsidy that helps with the price part. It takes up some of that. I think it takes up some of that slack.
I think we now have Jay back.
Okay, I'll jump off.
So thank you.
Is that, can you see anything at the moment?
No.
No. No, I've got it on my screen, but you're not seeing it. I'm sorry about this.
I'm not seeing you at all on your screen, just
Really?
your initials, yes.
Let me dial out and dial back in.
Perfect, thank you. We look as though Jay is now back, so hopefully his presentation could be available.
Are you seeing me?
We're hearing you, but we can't see you.
Okay, give me 1 minute. I'm going to try and dial in from a different computer. Something seems to there may be a problem with my video. I've no idea why. It hasn't happened before, but I can see that although my camera is on, it's not appearing in the window. So again, give me 2 minutes. I'll call
That's
back
okay.
in. Cheers.
As we're waiting for Jay to come back, it really highlights the reliance we all have on technology, really, doesn't it? And we're looking at technology across the board. A lot of people are now describing from an EV market that we're actually in a technology race. It's what the vehicle's able to do. It's all the connectivity it's having. And coming back slightly onto the range aspect, it wasn't, for me, people still have an inherent fear of range, despite the fact that the vehicles will do X 100 miles potentially. And the other side to that is that most probably people are going to use that occasionally. So is the issue from that side of it, the battery itself, in terms of how quickly you can actually charge it? Because the last thing you want to do is to have a range problem on a trip, but if the battery within the vehicle isn't capable of charging quickly, that to me is what's holding a number of people back for that odd occasion, because we've experienced that with the vehicle, and on a slow charger, I think we got a 12-mile range on a vehicle extra, having been charging for an hour and a half. So so that would make quite a long journey, but as the battery guy, how is that changing to stop that?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, again, it's not really a range issue on the vehicle level. I think whether people get worried about ranges on the charging infrastructure level. So, I mean, if you just make an analogy to an internal combustion engine vehicle market, no one would want to drive around with 500-600 miles worth of fuel on board, because you have all those efficiency issues. There's a direct analogy to battery technology. So you make a decision about how big a battery do you want to put on a vehicle from a cost point of view, from a weight point of view, and there's a range of answers to that depending on the use case for the vehicle. So at some point you draw the line there, and then you say, okay, well, really, the range on the modern battery electric vehicles is pretty strong, but clearly the thing where people are anxious is they don't necessarily believe that they will be able to charge when they're on the road, and that's partly a charging infrastructure issue. And if you look at, I mean, we track this. If you look at what's happened in terms of the EV fleet on the road over time versus the charging infrastructure, how you might call it, you know, like the sum of the charging infrastructure, particularly fast charging infrastructure on a public basis, it hasn't kept pace, which is fine to some degree because a lot of charging happens at home. But as we talk about mass adoption, that will become more and more of an issue in the next 5 to 10 years. And so the primary concern there is can you increase the charging infrastructure in the right way that people feel comfortable with that? But then you also have this issue you described around charging speeds as well. Now that you know, even for your top of the range vehicles at the moment, you can't charge at the 350 kilowatt rate for one, and if you could, you certainly can't do it for very long with any vehicle that's on the market at the moment. So I think maybe that's a good time. It looks like Jay's got his
perfect. Technology's now come back to us.
Oh, come on.
Welcome, Jay. Good to see you.
Sorry about that. Can you now see the screen okay?
We can see the screen, we can see you, so
right.
that you can now breathe again properly.
Sorry about that. For some reason, I had to change computers.
It's not your fault. We don't control technology at all, really, even though we probably ought to. So thanks for joining us, Jay, and the floor's yours, for want of a better word.
Thank you. So let's start off by having a look at the issues around electric vehicles. So obviously electric vehicles are clean at the tailpipe, but as they leave the showroom, they start off with a big CO2 deficit. What that figure is subject to debate. So in 2018, the Public-Private Partnership, UK low CVP, said it was about 55,000 kilometres. Now, only a couple of weeks ago, Polestar, in the interest of transparency, did a full life cycle analysis of their vehicles compared to a Volvo XC40. So this was a Polestar 2 against the XC40. And they said that for the average European power mix, it was 78,000 kilometres. Now, the interesting thing is that Polestar has a 78 kilowatt hour battery, which is large, but definitely not extra large. So as battery sizes go up, the break-even point goes up. So for 110 kilowatt hour battery pack, which is just becoming available now, the break-even point would be 110,000 kilometres. So in principle, you could eventually get a luxury car which would never reach break-even against a petrol car. Now, that simply can't be allowed to happen, because if there was ever a story that an electric car produced more CO2 than a petrol car, then we're looking at another Dieselgate story, and we really can't have that. So the key has to be to massively increase the production of clean electricity in order to manufacture batteries and recharge batteries. So Britain's actually got a good story to tell on this issue, that if you look at the change from 1990 to 2019 in terms of fossil fuels, so the first little chart there shows overall fossil fuels going down from 75% to 43%, and zero carbon fuels doubling. And the second little box shows the way that coal has been almost completely eliminated now from the UK energy mix, and the figure for 2020 will be even lower, and that renewables have gone up tenfold. And in fact, for the first quarter of 2020, for which the figures have just come out, which is a bit of a freak period because A, it was a very windy time, unusually so even for winter, and B, obviously we were going into lockdown, so there was less economic activity. But Britain actually managed to get to 60% zero carbon, which puts it only behind Norway, which is fully renewable because of hydroelectric, and France, which is zero carbon because of nuclear, but then nuclear has its own issues, which we won't go into here. But the vast majority of Britain's generating capacity was truly zero emission and completely renewable. So Britain actually has a very good story to tell. And that's important because if at the moment everybody's focusing on tailpipe emissions of electric vehicles. It'll move towards the production of electricity to power the batteries, but then it's going to move again to what about the electricity used to make the batteries, because it's only gradually entering the public consciousness that manufacturing is a hugely important part of the overall story. So it's going to become a big political issue, an environmental issue of where are you making these batteries for your cars. So it's all very well putting a battery factory in an Eastern Europe country that's powered by coal. And of course, the battery manufacturer might say, well, we've specially built our own electricity supply and we're much lower carbon than the national grid of our country where we're based. But the fact is, if your battery factory is down the road from a coal mine, it's still not a great environmental story. And from that point of view, Britain has a very good case that our environmental, the balance of our grid mix for electricity is such a good environmental story that it's a major pull factor to get battery factories into the UK. So let's have a look at some of the problems and issues around batteries and what we're doing about them. So the UK car industry, through the Automotive Council, has itself come up with the targets for UK battery development, which is largely financed by government, but it's the industry that sets the targets. So on every metric, we have numerical targets to meet. And actually, one of the most important ones, long term, is the very last item on that chart, which is recyclability, because again, that's another problem that is going to severely impact the environmental credentials of batteries if we don't do something about it. At the moment, we talk about second life for battery, and that's great. You might potentially take a battery out of an 8 or 10-year-old car and put it in somewhere else to generate electricity, possibly as a standby generator. But batteries don't have an infinite number of lives, and they're certainly not even cats. So they might have a second life. They might theoretically have a third life, but that's pretty unlikely. But sooner or later, they're going to have to be disposed of. And at the moment, most batteries are simply shredded. And given the contents of a battery, that's really not good. So Britain is determined to get to 95% recyclability over the next 15 years. And we do need to do that quickly so that we don't end up with a mountain of shredded batteries or export them to some third world country where they're shredded and disposed of in a not very friendly way. So in terms of R&D support, we are focused on every stage of the process, cross-sector R&D. So obviously that's going to involve the chemical sector and other sectors. The technology that goes onto the vehicle, so integrating the battery within the powertrain, and then the battery technology itself. And in terms of improving the whole powertrain, we have money both for battery development, which obviously is the key aspect, but also a battery by itself won't power a car. Effectively, a battery is a fuel tank. You still need the motor, the transmission, and a great deal of advanced power electronics to make the whole powertrain work. So we have a dedicated fund to address those other parts of the powertrain. Because after all, if we can improve the efficiency of the motor, if we can develop more advanced electronics with more advanced materials like gallium arsenide, for example, then we have a more efficient electric car, and therefore we can get away with a smaller battery. Now, just some thoughts about complementary powertrains. We heard about plug-in hybrids a few moments ago being very popular in Europe. Of course, there's a big issue there about how often are they actually plugged in, and that's why the British government reduced the incentives for plug-in hybrids a couple of years ago, because research showed that people were so pleased with the tax benefits of buying a plug-in vehicle, they didn't feel they had to get the extra benefit of saving money on fuel by actually plugging it in, and cars were being returned after 3-year leases with the cable still in its plastic casing, and it had never been used. So there's a big issue around plug-in hybrids and how we could incentivize people to actually use the plug-in part of the hybrid. Range extender electric vehicles technically look like a very good solution if we can get people interested in them. There is a danger that they end up as the Betamax of electric cars. Technically better than VHS videos for the older ones in the audience. We can all remember those. But if it's not going to be adopted and not get widespread acceptance, the fact that it's technically superior isn't going to help it very much. So there's an open question as to whether we could quickly develop range extender electric vehicles that would give a lower overall life cycle CO2 until we manage to decarbonise our grid electricity completely. Fuel cells is a potential. Generally speaking, the heavier the vehicle, the more attractive the fuel cell. Hence, for trucks and coaches, it seems to make a lot of sense. Larger SUVs, potentially. After all, if you start off with a 2.5-ton diesel SUV and add a large battery pack to it, you're looking at a 3-ton vehicle, which is starting to get ridiculous to transport 1 or 2 people for most of the time. So, for example, the government has recently given a grant to JLR to investigate the application of fuel cells for their vehicles. Obviously, one can imagine the vehicles that it would be most suitable for. But again, there's a generation issue around hydrogen. Most hydrogen today is generated by applying steam to hydrocarbons, which is fine for developing hydrogen to put in test vehicles, but as a long-term solution, it's a non-starter. You're basically taking a hydrocarbon, adding energy to it to turn it into hydrogen, so you can then power the vehicle that would have been perfectly happy with the hydrocarbon in the first place. It just doesn't make sense. What we need to develop is green hydrogen, so electrolyzing water via clean electricity to generate the hydrogen. Of course, then that comes back to the very first point, which is we need more green grid electricity, because that's where the electricity for the electrolyzer is going to come from. So what are the key messages? There aren't any more easy solutions. I could be accused of offering more problems than solutions in my presentation, but the issue is petrol and diesel was the easy solution. That means anything we do now is going to be more complicated and more difficult. There are going to be a lot more application-specific powertrains. So batteries in certain sizes of vehicles, fuel cells in a different size of vehicles. A bit like 40 years ago in the UK, diesel was purely for commercial, plus a few taxis, and petrol was for pretty well everything else, until diesel became attractive enough in terms of its performance, if not in other issues, to be used more widely. We need to follow the science, and there's a danger that people get so obsessed with batteries being the solution, they tend to forget that they're a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. The end is zero carbon. The means are whatever will get us there quickest, which may be batteries, it may be a type of hybrid, it may be fuel cells, it might theoretically be synthetic fuels. Bit of a long shot, but not impossible. So we need to keep an open mind and look at the performance of each type of powertrain in the application that we're looking at. So it might be different. It's probably a different answer for cars than for trucks, vans, somewhere in the middle. We don't have the answers yet. We just have a lot of questions. So that was a quick whistle-stop tour through my presentation. But I'd be very happy to answer any questions or discuss any of the issues in more detail.
Thanks, Jay. A question from me. Looking at our overall target, which is zero carbon, the interesting point that well, quite a few, but one that you made regarding the real need for a greater battery facilities within the UK, because it is a false picture. If, how do we, let me change that. How do we look at scoring an actual vehicle's green rating,
yes,
when you're taking the entire supply chain on where some of these cells and batteries have actually come from? Should that not be shown as what the overall car is in terms of its greenness?
Yes, and that in a previous life I was working on that. The first car manufacturer in Europe to do it for one model was actually Ford with the Galaxy Stroke S-Max in 2008. That was a 2-year program to develop a total life cycle assessment. Polestar, being closely linked with Volvo, has now done something very similar. And they want to bring pressure on other manufacturers to do the same thing. I mean, Polestar should be given a lot of credit. You know, those figures they've come up with are not biased in their favour. They're playing a pretty straight bat on this one. And they're now throwing down the gauntlet to others to do the same thing. Now, not all manufacturers are probably going to do the same thing, but we're starting to get decent quality information about, on average, how much embedded CO2 there is in a battery. And I think the incentive for car manufacturers to be more open is, if they don't do it and come up with some figures of their own that are credible, there are some pretty extreme environmental organisations that will make up figures for them, which will be considerably less beneficial to the car manufacturers. So there is pressure, and sensible pressure, self-interested pressure, if you like, to do that. And I think it will gradually become more of an issue. I mean, most people at the moment don't understand the concept of embedded CO2, but then before VW, very few people understood the concept of diesel NOx either, and that came to the fore pretty quickly. So I think the car companies need to take some defensive measures, publish more figures, and also the battery manufacturers need to be much more aware of where they're putting their battery factories, because these are investments that are going to last 15 years. If they put it in the wrong place and people have a backlash against a factory in a certain Eastern European country, then they've just spent $2 or $3 billion on something that has a big problem.
Thank you. We obviously have now sort of gone over time, and it's more time sensitive than when we're in person and there's a stage because of the knock-on effect. But to both you and Adam, thank you very much. Obviously, we must do this again, and sort of because we could have chatted for a long time after this. But both were really good presentations. Thank you. Sorry you had the technical challenges as well, but that's one of the facts of life with a virtual event, isn't it? So thank you to both, and we better sign off because otherwise I'll be accused of pushing the whole program back. But thanks again, and keep safe, and we'll talk to you both soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.